A pregnant wife walks into a luxury restaurant and calmly exposes her millionaire husband's secret life, his affair, his embezzlement, and the shocking truth about their unborn child. What follows is not just revenge, it's total destruction. Lies unravel, fortunes collapse, and a woman rises from betrayal to power. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Tell us below. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable true-life stories like this one. I used to believe betrayal had a sound, maybe the slam of a door, a shouted confession, or a sob whispered into the hollow dark. But when it happened to me, it came quiet, almost graceful, like the way perfume lingers on fabric that doesn't belong to you. It was a Wednesday night in early spring. I remember because the tulips in our terrace planter had just begun to bloom, and I was placing the ultrasound photo of our son into a silver frame for Nathan's nightstand. I had just turned 38. My back ached, my ankles were swollen, and my heart, though I didn't know it yet, was beginning to splinter. Nathan texted around 9 p.m. as he had been lately. Late meeting. Don't wait up. Sterile. Corporate. He didn't call me L anymore. No love you, just those cold pixels that glowed on my screen like a warning I wasn't ready to read. I had seen the pattern forming, the so-called board meetings that ran later and later. The second cell phone, always locked. The faint whiff of something citrusy and floral clinging to the collar of his cashmere coat. Too youthful to be mine, too expensive to be random. But I still set his plate on the marble island, out of habit or hope, or maybe both. I lit the stovetop warmer to keep it hot and waited, rubbing my belly in slow circles, whispering to my son about how his daddy used to trace his kicks like constellations. Used to. Past tense. By midnight, the food was cold. The warm line of memory that had cradled me in our penthouse, the place he'd once called the temple of our future, had grown drafty and echoing. Still, I waited. Then, sometime around 12:30, the elevator dinged. His keycard beeped. The door opened. He looked surprised to see me awake, though he tried to mask it. He smelled like whiskey, a French varietal I could name from a mile away, and something else, something sweet and wrong. I stood there in my robe, barefoot on the travertine floor, and my eyes met the collar of his shirt first. The smudge of lipstick wasn't red. It was coral, playful, a shade I hadn't worn since grad school. I didn't want to wake you, he muttered, dropping his coat on the back of a bar stool like it wasn't a $1,000 brioni. You shouldn't be on your feet. He said it with that same low, measured tone he used when closing hedge fund deals, concern packaged like command. I gave him a tired smile, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to still be a wife. You're sleeping in the guest room again? I asked, careful to keep my voice level. He didn't flinch. You've been tossing. I figured I'd let you rest. I nodded, walked past him, and closed our bedroom door with a click. The next morning, I found his second phone, what he called his work line, left carelessly on the kitchen island. Maybe it was the sleep deprivation. Maybe it was divine intervention. Either way, I picked it up. One text lit the screen. Kira, last night was electric. Can't stop thinking about you. Can't wait for Le Seraphon. My dress will knock you out. I froze. Not because of the words, but because of the name. Le Seraphon. He had tried to book us a table there for our 5th anniversary, told me even his assistant couldn't get past the wait list. But suddenly, a reservation had materialized for this Kira. The marble countertop steadied me as my legs threatened to give. The vase I had just arranged with tulips, the ones blooming like hope outside, tipped slightly. A single drop of water fell onto the surface with a soft plink. That sound, I realized, was what betrayal truly sounded like. Small, final, inescapable. I should have cried. I didn't. I walked into the nursery instead, the pale green wallpaper we had chosen together. The handmade mobile I'd ordered from a boutique in Vermont? The crib, he said, was too expensive this quarter, but bought a Rolex the same week. I sat on the glider, our son kicking against my ribs like he was knocking on the truth, asking to be let in. I whispered to him through tears I didn't know I was shedding. It's okay, sweetheart. We're okay. Mama sees it now. But seeing wasn't the same as understanding, and understanding wasn't enough. That night, I stared out at the city from 30 floors up. The lights looked like jewels on velvet. So beautiful, so cold. I thought about how Nathan had once stood beside me here, arms around my waist, telling me this view was our reward for all the years we struggled. I believed him then. I didn't believe him now. I believed in what I saw. I believed in Kira's text message. I believed in the lipstick, in the missed calls, in the silence between us that had grown so loud I couldn't sleep through it. And I believed, most of all, that if I didn't act now, I would lose myself. Not to him. To what he had turned me into, a placeholder. A decorative piece in the perfect narrative he sold to investors and society columns. The beautiful, pregnant wife of a self-made man. I wasn't going to play that role anymore. As I tucked myself into bed that night, alone in a California king that had never felt larger, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang 4 times before the gravelly voice answered. "Elise Marlowe," the man said, amused. "Haven't heard from you since you curated that train wreck of a surrealist show at the Whitney." "I need your help, Hal," I said, "and I need you to be discreet." There was a pause, a breath of understanding. "Is it him?" "Yes." "What do you want to know?" "Everything." And just like that, the first domino tipped. The betrayal hadn't started with lipstick. It had started with lies, with erasure. With a man I once loved who stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as optics. I didn't know what I was going to find. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be the silent woman in the penthouse anymore. I was going to be the storm. The envelope Hal gave me was thick. It thudded softly when he dropped it on the cafe table between us, like a book you didn't want to finish but couldn't stop reading. The man hadn't changed much in the 15 years since I last saw him. He still wore the same brown leather jacket that smelled like cigarettes and rain, his silver hair pulled back in a lazy knot. His eyes, though, those hadn't dulled. They scanned me like I was a museum piece with a hidden crack, a flaw only he could see. "Everything you asked for, Elise," he said, "and probably more than you want." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the ceramic mug in my hand. It was cold. I'd let my tea sit too long. I wasn't thirsty anyway. I was starving for truth. I waited until I got home to open it. Alone in the penthouse, I locked myself in the guest room, Nathan's new favorite, and sat cross-legged on the carpet like a child at story time. Except this story wasn't fiction. It was my life, torn apart and bound back together in documentation. The first page was a glossy printout of her. Kira Langley. She looked like a perfume ad come to life. Blonde, impossibly thin, with eyes too wide to trust. She was mid-20-something, barely older than the interns Nathan used to call kids. In one photo, she wore a bikini, standing on the edge of a yacht somewhere obscenely blue, holding a champagne flute with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. In another, she was draped in Chanel, her face half turned, as if she'd practiced that expression in the mirror until it became second nature. Influencer, brand ambassador. Her resume was her face, her currency was the illusion of a perfect life, and Nathan was underwriting it. There were screenshots of her Instagram feed, each post more curated than the last. Sunsets with #blessed, designer handbags with gifted, spa days captioned "self-care is success." But it wasn't the captions that got me. It was the way she was looking at the camera, always looking at it, always aware of it, never candid, never real. Hal's report laid it out in brutal order. Nathan met her at a charity gala 3 months prior. She had been seated at his table, a last-minute seat filler placed there by a mutual PR rep who thought they'd vibe. And they did. Oh, they vibed all right. 3 days later, charges appeared on a black card, registered to an LLC I'd never heard of. Dinners, jewelry, a lease on a furnished apartment in Soho with a walk-in closet and pre-war crown moldings. She even had a dog. A miniature Pomeranian named Waffles, according to one of the photos. Of course she did. Then came the airline tickets, a weekend trip to St. Bart's, first class, under the same LLC. I stared at the receipt, my throat dry. That weekend, Nathan told me he was at an investor summit in Boston. I'd believed him. I'd spent the entire Sunday painting the nursery in pale blue while he was drinking tropical cocktails out of coconuts with Kira. But the part that undid me wasn't the receipts. It wasn't even the pictures of them walking hand in hand through downtown, laughing like college kids. It was the date. The affair had started, officially, 6 weeks after our second IVF treatment. 6 weeks after I lay on a sterile table, gripping Nathan's hand, praying with every cell in my body that this one would work. I remember his face that day, stoic, encouraging, a little too still. I thought he was being strong for me. Now I know he was just biding time. While I marveled at the flicker of a heartbeat on a screen, he was slipping off to kiss Kira under the awning of her Soho apartment. I pressed the printed photo flat against the carpet, my thumbs smudging the edge. There was Nathan, his hand on the small of her back, a lazy smile curving his lips as he leaned into her. It was the kind of kiss that said comfort, familiarity, intimacy that doesn't flinch. It was the kiss I hadn't received in months. I felt something hot rise in my throat, not sadness, not shock, something closer to rage, a mother's rage, because suddenly it wasn't just about me. It was about the life growing inside me, our son, the child he claimed to want so desperately. And yet here he was, pouring thousands into the lifestyle of a woman who wouldn't know an umbilical cord from a silk belt. I stood shakily and carried the file to the kitchen. The lights were dim. The silence rang. I placed the photo on the same marble island where I'd first found the text, right where I had once set plates for two. It belonged there, like a final course neither of us had ordered, but always knew was coming. For hours, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through Kira's profile until the battery on my phone died. I found an old account of hers, buried in the archives. Back when she was brunette, rounder in the face, and posted about final exams and college parties in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There was even a picture of handmade jewelry, delicate silver pieces with tiny emerald beads. She had a small Etsy shop. She had been someone. Now she was a mannequin in a luxury store window, bought and paid for by a man who couldn't even come home on time. I don't know why that broke me more than the affair itself. Maybe because I saw a version of myself in that girl. A woman who once wanted to build something real, who traded authenticity for access, and got lost in the glitter. But pity is a dangerous thing. It softens you. And I couldn't afford soft, not now. By sunrise I had a plan. I wasn't going to confront Nathan in our home. That would only give him power. He'd deflect, accuse me of hormones, twist my pain into something laughable. No, he was a man of image, of theater. He needed a stage. I opened my laptop and searched for the email to La Seraphim. I drafted a message under my maiden name saying I was planning a surprise anniversary dinner. I asked for a discreet table, not too close to the front. I attached a generous tip as incentive. The reply came 5 minutes later. Reservation confirmed. April 18th, 8:30 p.m. I sat back, my hand resting on the curve of my stomach. The stage was set. Now it was time to rehearse my entrance. I never believed in war paint until Monica pulled that red silk dress from the garment bag. She showed up at my door the afternoon of the reservation like a woman on a mission, her leather tote slung over her shoulder and a spark in her eyes that reminded me of the girl who used to talk me into sneaking out past curfew. But this wasn't mischief. This was battle prep. "You're not wearing beige tonight," she said flatly, stepping into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "No neutrals. No pastels. This is not a baby shower, it's an execution." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. My nerves had spent the last 48 hours tightening into steel, and even Monica's fire couldn't quite pierce through the calm I'd built around myself. She unzipped the bag slowly, like revealing a relic, and there it was. Deep crimson, cut to flatter a woman who was both strong and 7 months pregnant. It shimmered in the afternoon light, not flashy but impossible to ignore. "I can't wear that," I whispered. "I'll look like—" "A woman," she interrupted. "Not a victim, a woman with teeth." I didn't argue, I just reached for it, running my fingers across the fabric like it was sacred. It felt cool, smooth, powerful. In the mirror, the reflection stunned me. I looked complete, not flawless but real. A round belly beneath silk, a spine that refused to bend, eyes that no longer watered at the thought of his betrayal. The curator was gone. The mother had arrived. And she wasn't there to negotiate. Monica was already placing items on the table, her so-called war kit, backup lipstick, compact mirror, blotting sheets, and tucked beneath it all, her phone already charged, set to video mode. "I'll keep it subtle," she said, "just sitting on the table, angled right. I'll catch his face the second it hits him." I didn't doubt it. Monica had always been the one who recorded everything. School plays, birthdays, even my awkward toast at her second wedding. But this was different. This time, the footage wasn't for memories, it was for evidence. I retrieved the box from the drawer. Small, velvet-lined, elegantly gift-wrapped. Inside lay the glossy 8x10 photograph of Nathan and Kira kissing under the awning of her Soho apartment. Beside it, the incorporation papers for Langley Holdings, with Kira's name printed neatly beneath the director line. And the crown jewel, the bank transfer slip, showing a $2 million wire from Croft Equity Global to her company account. I closed the lid gently, tied the satin ribbon with practiced hands. "This," I said, nodding toward the box, "isn't revenge. It's clarity." Monica smirked. "Call it whatever you want, just hand-deliver it like it's dessert." I didn't eat that evening. My nerves refused food. Instead, I slipped on the heels I hadn't worn since the early months of pregnancy, low enough not to topple me, high enough to click authoritatively on marble floors. I painted my lips to match the dress, tied my hair back in a sleek chignon, and sprayed the lightest touch of perfume behind each ear. Nathan always said he loved that scent. He wouldn't anymore. As the car pulled up to La Séraphin, the air shifted. The city, still buzzing outside the tinted windows, faded into background noise. I sat in silence, hands resting gently on my belly, feeling James shift inside me like he could sense what was coming. "You okay?" Monica asked softly. "I'm ready," I said. The maitre d' recognized me from the society pages, though he pretended not to. "Welcome, Miss Langley," he said, using the name on the reservation. "Your table is prepared." Miss Langley. The irony wasn't lost on me. He led us through the main dining floor, past towering floral arrangements and hushed conversations. The restaurant was opulent without being vulgar. Brass fixtures, white linen, soft candlelight. The scent of truffle oil and ambition hung in the air. And then I saw them. Nathan, in his navy bespoke suit, holding a glass of Bordeaux like a trophy. Kira, glittering in silver, her skin glowing under the lights, her laughter shrill and too loud for a place like this. They looked like a magazine spread, power couple of the moment. Until they saw me. Nathan's expression fractured in real time. His mouth parted slightly, then closed. The hand holding the wine glass hovered mid-air, frozen. Color drained from his face like ink washed under running water. Kira turned to follow his gaze, her smile fading, her brow furrowing, confusion, then recognition, and then horror. My presence hit them like a car crash in slow motion. I didn't stop. I didn't even blink. The maitre guided us to our table, strategically placed a few feet from theirs with a perfect line of sight. Monica sat first, carefully adjusting her phone, the camera lens peeking from beneath a folded napkin. I followed, unfolding my own napkin with surgical calm. For 15 minutes, I ignored them completely. I looked at the menu, sipped my water, leaned in as Monica whispered about an art exhibit opening next month. But the heat from Nathan's stare burned against my cheekbones. Kira's hand fidgeted with her fork. Nathan's phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times. He was texting me. I had blocked him hours ago. When the waiter arrived, I gave a small nod. "We won't be ordering just yet." I reached into my bag and pulled out the velvet box, setting it gently in front of me. Monica adjusted the angle on her phone. "Ready?" she murmured. I gave a single nod. I stood, heels clicking softly, and crossed the space between our tables like a woman on a runway made of glass. The restaurant hushed around me, not silent, but holding its breath. Diners looked up from foie gras and wine pairings to watch the scene unfold. No one dared speak. Nathan watched me approach like a man staring down a natural disaster. I stopped beside their table and looked directly at him. "Sorry to interrupt your investor meeting," I said, my voice clear and calm. "You forgot something at home. I thought she might want it." I placed the box on the table, right beside Kira's champagne flute. She stared at it like it was ticking. Nathan said nothing. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Kira reached for the box with trembling fingers. The ribbon slipped free. The lid lifted. She saw the photograph first. Her gasp was audible. A sound between pain and panic. Then she saw the documents, her own name printed under Langley Holdings. The bank transfer. The amount. Her lips moved, forming words that made no sound. She turned to Nathan. "What is this?" she whispered. "Is this real? $2 million? You told me." Nathan tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I leaned in, just enough for them to hear, but loud enough for the room to feel. "That's not a gift, sweetheart. It's a severance package. Croft Equity is a house of cards. He's been moving assets illegally. And you? You're not his partner. You're his offshore account." Kira stared at me, her mascara starting to run. The silence in the room shattered, forks paused mid-air, heads turned fully now. I turned to Nathan one last time, looking at the man I had once built a life with and no longer recognized. "I'll see you in court." Then I turned and walked back to my table, each step measured, grounded, final. Monica stood as I approached, eyes shining. She said nothing. She didn't have to. We walked out together, into the night, into the flashbulbs waiting at the valet, into the beginning of something entirely new. And behind us, somewhere in the silence of a ruined evening, a woman began to cry. By the time the heavy oak doors of Le Séraphin closed behind us, the silence we left behind had become a legend in the making. The footage Monica captured, every trembling blink from Kira, every drop of sweat glistening on Nathan's temples, the elegant unveiling of betrayal in a gift-wrapped box, was already uploading in the back seat of the car. She said nothing as we rode through the city, the hum of tires against asphalt the only sound between us. But I saw the way her jaw set. I saw the way her fingers, usually so relaxed, clenched around her phone. I looked out the window and saw Manhattan in a way I hadn't in months. Not through Nathan's eyes or through the lens of illusion, but through my own, raw, honest, unforgiving, beautiful because it didn't pretend. The first message came before we even reached the curb outside my building. "Is this real?" She walked in like a queen. "Who is she?" Red dress reckoning. Strangers had filmed the moment. Diners, waitstaff, a sommelier with a quick hand. Grainy videos were spreading like wildfire across social media. But Monica's clip, that was gasoline. By midnight, it had gone global. The hashtags piled up. Crimson confrontation, Croft collapse, Mistress meltdown. And there at the center of it all was me, Elise Marlowe, pregnant, radiant, and unflinching as I delivered what some influencer called the most savage takedown of the decade. I didn't feel savage. I felt steady, grounded, like I'd finally stopped bleeding from a wound I hadn't known was mortal. Nathan tried to reach me. Calls, texts, emails, all blocked. When I returned to the penthouse that night, I did not sleep. I placed the crimson dress carefully over the back of a chair, removed my earrings one by one, and stood barefoot on the balcony, the wind tugging at my hair. Somewhere below, the city buzzed with whispers of my name. And somewhere not far from that, Nathan was watching everything crumble. He didn't come home. Instead, I got a call the next morning from an unknown number. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. "Elise Marlowe?" the voice asked. Calm, measured. "Official, this is she. My name is Mark Yoon. I'm with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I imagine you're receiving a lot of calls today, but I'd appreciate a moment of your time." I straightened, walked into the living room, sat down. "I'm listening." "We've had concerns about Mr. Marlowe and his firm for over a year," he continued, "but we lacked a through line, something to follow. Your very public presentation last night may have provided us with that." I smiled without meaning to. "I have documentation," I said. "Bank statements, corporate filings, timelines. I kept everything." There was a pause. "We'd like to meet," he said. "I'll be ready." When I ended the call, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For the first time, this wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It was criminal. It was bigger than my marriage or my heartbreak. This wasn't just a man cheating on his pregnant wife. This was a man building an empire on deception, and now the foundation was cracking. The days that followed blurred into interviews, document scans, meetings with lawyers and regulators. Monica became my buffer, answering calls, screening threats, laughing at the people who called me a homewrecker's nightmare. I never responded to the noise. I didn't have to. The truth did all the talking. Then, on a crisp Friday morning, my attorney, Linda Chavez, walked into my apartment with a folder under her arm and a look on her face I had never seen before, grim and curious at the same time. "We've received a subpoena for deposition," she said, placing the folder on the table. "But there's something you should see first." Inside was a report from the SEC's forensic audit team, wire transfers, offshore accounts, and a payment trail that stopped me cold. Langley Holdings, the shell company in Kira's name, had received far more than just luxury rent and Cartier gifts. There was another trail, a more discreet one, a clinic in Zurich, a fertility clinic. The moment I read the words, my vision narrowed. My pulse thundered in my ears. Mark Yoon confirmed it later that day. Kira had been preparing for a surrogate pregnancy, funded quietly, internationally, with Nathan's money. But it didn't make sense. Why would a man investing in a child with his mistress also spend 2 years trying to have a baby with me? That's when Linda leaned in, eyes steely, and said he wasn't. At first I didn't understand. He knew he was sterile, she continued, has been since his teens, a condition triggered by early-onset MS. He kept it from you. Every IVF procedure, every hormone shot, every negative test, it was all a show. I couldn't breathe. He never intended to be the father, she said gently. He wanted the image of a perfect family, public, sympathetic, marketable. But his real heir, that was the one he tried to create in secret. The betrayal was no longer emotional. It was existential. I had built my life on a lie. Not a single misstep, but an orchestration so cold, so calculated, that it bordered on sociopathy. The man who whispered nursery plans into my ear at night had never intended to raise that child. My child. I stood at the window, looking down at the city. I thought I knew. It looked different now. Like every skyscraper had betrayed me, like every light was complicit. And yet, I placed a hand on my belly. James kicked, strong and sure. He was real. He was mine. He was not the product of Nathan Marlowe's ambition. He was the product of my hope, of my perseverance, of my refusal to give up on the life I wanted, even when I had no idea I was doing it alone. In that moment, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I was beyond anger. I was dangerous. This wasn't about marriage or infidelity. This wasn't about some sad, glittery influencer clinging to power or a man who mistook control for love. This was about legacy. And Nathan's was about to turn to ash. I turned from the window, wiped my face, and called Linda back into the room. When this goes to trial, I said, I want everything. Every cent, every share, every name. Linda nodded. You'll have it. And I would. Not for revenge, for justice, for my son, for every woman who had ever been gaslit into thinking her pain was overreaction. I wasn't just coming for Nathan's fortune. I was coming for his story. And I was going to rewrite every single line. The first time I stepped into the federal building for the SEC deposition, I was wearing a navy dress that used to be too formal for my taste. Now it felt like armor. The elevator ride was silent, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional cough of a tired clerk. Linda walked beside me, calm and composed, a leather briefcase in one hand and a 1,000-yard stare in her eyes. We passed rows of sterile glass offices until we reached a windowless room that smelled faintly of paper and bad coffee. Inside, a long mahogany table stretched beneath overhead lighting, too bright to feel welcoming. It was the kind of space designed to intimidate. But I wasn't here to flinch. Nathan wasn't there yet. But his legal team was. 3 men in matching pinstripe suits sat on one side, their faces unreadable but their eyes sharp with calculation. They barely acknowledged me when I walked in, as if I were still just the woman in the viral video. An inconvenience, a PR disaster in lipstick. I sat across from them and placed the folder on the table. The one that held the emails, the bank statements, the corporate filings, all of it. Mark Yoon arrived shortly after, his presence steadying the way a lighthouse steadies a storm-beaten ship. He shook my hand without hesitation. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marlowe," he said. I nodded. "Let's begin." And we did. The next 6 hours were a blur of legal language and slow-burning revelations. Charts projected on screens, wire transfers dissected, offshore accounts traced back to shell corporations whose only common link was Nathan's signature buried in fine print. I didn't flinch when they pulled up the timeline. I knew it better than anyone. Kira's apartment lease signed days after our second IVF attempt. The first luxury purchases routed through Langley Holdings. A week later, a wire labeled Legacy Fund transferred to a Zurich clinic known for surrogacy. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a blueprint, a parallel life built beside mine. I kept my voice even. I told them what I knew, piece by piece. No emotion, no dramatics, just facts. That was what mattered now. Truth was the only weapon I had left, and I wielded it like a scalpel. Around the 3rd hour, Arthur Kendrick arrived, Nathan's CFO. He looked like a man aged by guilt, hair thinning, hands twitching, eyes darting like a cornered animal. He had been granted limited immunity in exchange for testimony. But it was clear he knew this wasn't a pardon. This was penance. He sat down at the far end of the table and began to talk. His voice was flat, almost robotic. He outlined the flow of funds from Croft Equity to the shell companies, how they moved the money through real estate investments and fake vendor contracts. How Kira's lifestyle was only a fraction of the embezzlement. I watched Linda as she leaned forward, asking precise questions. Her tone never rose, never sharpened, but it sliced just the same. Then, she pulled up a new slide on the screen. A name appeared at the top in bold font. Schiller Clinic, Zurich. Kendrick's breath caught audibly. "Mr. Kendrick," Linda said gently, "why was Croft Equity transferring money to a private fertility clinic in Switzerland?" His eyes shifted. His hands twitched again. I could see the sweat forming on his upper lip. "It was for a child," he said eventually, not meeting my eyes. "Miss Langley, she was the intended mother. There was a surrogate involved. The transfers covered medical expenses and legal retainers." I didn't move, but the air shifted in my lungs, became thinner, more brittle. A child. Another child. My throat tightened as Kendrick continued. The plan was discreet. Offshore accounts. Legal ownership of the embryo was assigned to the shell company. Mr. Marlowe wanted the child's existence and his connection to it entirely untraceable. Linda's eyes flicked to me, but I didn't need her sympathy. This was no longer shock. This was confirmation. Nathan hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been building an entirely separate bloodline, one removed from scandal, carefully curated and buried in international law. But then Kendrick said something that made the room go cold. "He couldn't have children," he muttered. Nathan, he'd known for years, since he was 18, MS-related sterility. It was part of his medical file. I assumed his wife knew. I felt the world fall sideways. The chair beneath me didn't tilt, the table didn't move, but everything else did. I remembered the hormone injections, the ultrasounds, the disappointment every time I saw a single pink line instead of two. I remembered the tears Nathan wiped away the night he brought home champagne after our third embryo implanted successfully. I remembered thinking he must be so happy. And he had been. Because he knew it had never been his child. Not biologically, not genetically, not ever. He let me believe we were trying. He let me suffer the roller coaster of fertility treatments, the emotional and physical toll, all while he smiled and held my hand and told me we were so close. I wasn't building a family with him. I was part of his PR strategy. I looked down at my stomach, at the life moving inside me, his tiny feet pressing against the wall of my body like a gentle reminder. I'm here. I'm real. And he was. He was mine. He was never part of Nathan's plan. He was part of mine. A plan built on love, on faith, on a kind of courage my husband had never possessed. I stood slowly. "Are we done here?" I asked. Linda glanced at Mark, who nodded. "For today," he said. Kendrick didn't look at me as I passed him. Back in the hallway, Linda kept her voice low. "I'm sorry." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Don't be. This is clarity." We rode the elevator in silence. I watched my reflection in the mirrored doors, navy dress, steady posture, eyes that held fire instead of tears. Downstairs, the city pulsed like a living thing. My phone buzzed with messages, notifications, people dissecting every frame of the confrontation at Le Séraphin. But all of it felt far away. Because this wasn't just about exposure anymore. This was war. And I wasn't going to win by burning it all down. I was going to win by outlasting the fire. By the time I reached the penthouse, I had already drafted the press statement in my head. I had already imagined the courtroom, the jury, the judge who would hear what Nathan did. Not just to me, but to our investors, our employees, the very foundation of trust he built Croft Equity on. This wasn't about heartbreak. This was about legacy. And I was going to make damn sure that his ended with disgrace. And mine was just beginning. The night after Kendrick's confession, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one hand resting over my belly, feeling James turn and nudge against my ribs like he was searching for a way out of a story I hadn't meant for him to be part of. Sterile. The word echoed like a curse. It filled every empty corner of the penthouse and turned the silence into a scream. Nathan had known. All those years of IVF, the heartbreak, the hormonal chaos, the weeping into bathroom towels, he had known it was all theater. And he let it happen anyway. No, that's not strong enough. He designed it that way. I remembered the way he looked at me after the third failed attempt, the way his voice trembled when he said, "Maybe we're not meant to be parents." I'd thought it was his own despair talking, but it wasn't. It was strategy. He knew there was no we, just me, just my body, just my hope. And he used it. I was the carefully chosen face of a lie. The well-dressed, pregnant wife, perfect for interviews, for magazine spreads, for holiday newsletters to investors. While in the shadows, he built his real family with a blonde influencer whose only loyalty was to her follower count. But the cruelest part? The detail that kept my stomach churning long into the morning? He hadn't just lied about fatherhood. He had used me to prop up a fantasy, his fantasy, of a respectable, grounded man. He had leveraged my uterus like a prop in a pitch deck, all while funneling millions into a secret heir he hoped would carry his name beyond the financial collapse he clearly saw coming. That heir didn't exist. The surrogate pregnancy was terminated the moment his assets were frozen. James was all that was left. And James wasn't his, not biologically, not emotionally, not morally. I spent the morning in the nursery, the soft green wallpaper, the pale wood crib, the framed sonogram photo I could no longer look at the same way. I sat in the rocking chair and held a stuffed elephant Nathan had bought on one of his business trips. The same trip I now knew he spent in bed with Kira. The betrayal didn't make me feel small. It made me feel awake. It was as if I'd spent years walking through a perfectly lit museum of my life only to discover the exhibits were made of cardboard and shadows. Now, the walls were gone, and I was standing under the sun, and that sun hurt like hell. That day, I made another call. Not to the SEC, not to Linda. I called Monica. "I need to leave the city," I said. "Just for a few days." "Where to?" "Home." Our parents' estate was nestled in the Connecticut hills, far enough from Manhattan that it felt like another country. Trees instead of skyscrapers, silence instead of sirens. I hadn't been there in almost a year. Nathan hated the drive, said it was wasted time. Monica didn't ask questions. She just showed up an hour later with her SUV and a thermos of mint tea. "We're going," she said, her voice firm. "Pack light. I already loaded the baby bag." The ride-up was quiet. Neither of us needed to fill the air. She played soft classical music, Debussy, I think, and let me drift in and out of thought. As the city disappeared behind us, I realized my shoulders were starting to drop from their permanent place around my ears. The trees turned golden as we neared the estate, their leaves rustling like they were welcoming us home. When we pulled into the gravel drive, the familiar scent of damp earth and old wood wrapped around me. The house, gray stone, wide porches, ivy curling along its edges, had never looked more like sanctuary. My mother came to the door with her hands folded and her eyes already red. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just opened her arms and let me fall into them. She held me like I was still a little girl who'd scraped her knees, not a woman gutted by a global scandal. My father came out next, his face unreadable, but I saw the way his hands trembled when he touched my back. He was a man of few words, but as I passed him on the way inside, he murmured, "I'm proud of you." We spent the rest of the day inside. Monica fielded calls while I napped under a hand-stitched quilt in the sunroom. I don't remember dreaming. I just remember waking up without dread in my throat for the first time in weeks. The next day, I walked the gardens. James moved inside me, slow and steady, and I talked to him like we were old friends. "You don't know it yet," I whispered, "but you saved me." Because it was true. If I hadn't been pregnant, I might have accepted Nathan's lies. I might have pretended I didn't see the messages, the perfume, the receipts. I might have let him gaslight me into silence. I might have stayed trapped in silk and stone and manipulation. But with James, everything changed. I wasn't just a woman anymore. I was a mother, and I was done tolerating disgrace. I stayed at the estate for a week. During that time, Linda worked with Mark to finalize the lawsuit. The federal charges were stacking: embezzlement, wire fraud, securities fraud, tax evasion, and of course, misuse of company funds to build a second life with a woman who could now barely show her face online. Kira's Instagram had gone dark. The brands that once paid her thousands per post? Gone. The luxury apartment? Vacated. The $2 million investment account? Frozen. She'd become what Nathan never prepared her to be: expendable. Meanwhile, I was growing stronger. I gave one exclusive interview to a respected financial journalist, not a tabloid, and told the truth with measured grace. I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I let the facts speak. And when she asked what I would tell other women in my position, I answered simply, never mistake silence for strength. and never let anyone weaponize your hope against you. On my last night at the estate, I stood on the back porch, watching the stars peek through the clouds. Monica joined me, handing me a mug of warm milk. "You're ready, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. "Trial's coming," she said. I didn't flinch. "Good," I said. "Let them see what survival looks like." And for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, I smiled. Not out of vengeance, out of certainty. The truth was mine now, and so was the future. The trial began on a rainy Monday morning. The kind of rain that didn't shout or storm, just whispered down steady and cold, as if the sky itself had made peace with what was about to unfold. It misted the courthouse steps, slicked the pavement, and gave everything a hush, as if the whole city had stopped to watch justice take its first step toward daylight. I arrived early. I didn't want to make an entrance. I wanted to occupy. Nathan's legal team tried to pretend they weren't flustered, but I could read the tension in their collars. Their client, the brilliant, charming architect of Croft Equity, had become a ghost of his former self. He'd lost weight. His face, once polished and smug, had drawn into itself. The pinstripes looked too big on him now. The confidence that once clung to him like cologne had vanished, replaced by panic just barely masked behind performative calm. And I was unshakable. I wore navy again. Simple, strong. The color of a storm after it passes. My belly, now rounder than ever, pressed confidently beneath the fabric. A symbol not of fragility, but of continuity. I took my place in the front row beside Linda, flanked by Mark Yoon and a sea of courtroom sketch artists trying to capture what rage looks like when it no longer needs to raise its voice. The prosecution opened with precision. They started not with numbers, but with Nathan's words. Clipped video segments of his own statements to investors, polished interviews, keynote addresses at finance summits. They let the jury hear the promises: stability, legacy, integrity, words he'd wielded like scripture. Then they unraveled them, chart by chart, document by document. Every company Nathan had propped up with falsified returns. Every asset hidden behind shell corporations, every fake vendor account and falsified board approval. They didn't just accuse him of greed. They proved he was a man who had weaponized trust. And then they brought me to the stand. The courtroom fell into a hush as I walked up the aisle, my heels echoing softly against the hardwood floor. I stepped into the witness box and looked out, not just at the jury, but at the sea of strangers and cameras and whispers, waiting to devour every word I spoke. I didn't flinch. Linda's voice was calm, steady. She guided me through the timeline. The IVF, the receipts, the discovery of Kira Langley, the creation of Langley Holdings, the Shell Corporation, the fertility clinic, Zurich. I told them the story, not as a woman scorned, but as a woman who had walked through fire and come out clean. I told them about the red dress, about La Serafa, about the moment I placed a box on the table and watched a myth collapse. And I told them what it meant, what it really meant, to discover that your marriage, your child, your future had been a costume sewn for the benefit of boardrooms and balance sheets. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't tremble, because I didn't need to. When Linda asked why I had come forward, I answered without hesitation. Because his crimes weren't just about money, they were about people, about everyone who believed him, about the women he used, the investors he lied to, the family he pretended to cherish. I'm here because truth deserves a place in the record. From the corner of my eye, I saw Nathan shift in his seat. He wouldn't meet my gaze. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Former employees testified. Accountants, compliance officers, even Kendrick, though he looked like he was sweating through every minute of it. The prosecution built the case brick by brick until the room began to feel like it might collapse under the weight of it all. Nathan never took the stand. Of course he didn't. Cowards never walk into fire. When the verdict came, the courtroom buzzed like a beehive, trembling on the edge of silence. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, looked straight ahead. We, the jury, find the defendant, Nathan Marlowe, guilty on all counts. Guilty of wire fraud, guilty of securities fraud, guilty of money laundering, guilty of conspiracy. Each word was a gavel in the center of my chest, not pain, not relief, but resolution. The weight of pretending was gone. The story he wrote for us had been publicly ripped apart. Nathan collapsed slightly in his chair, his face slack, his lips twitching. His lawyers whispered, frantic. But there was nothing left to do. No narrative left to control. The judge called for sentencing 2 weeks later. I was there. So was the press. So was the world. Judge Hamilton, a man known for leniency when appropriate, did not hold back. He looked Nathan in the eyes and spoke like thunder wrapped in silk. Mr. Marlowe, your actions reflect a fundamental contempt for honesty, for responsibility, and for those who trusted you. You hid behind affluence and charm, behind a fabricated family and a fraudulent empire. You are not a victim of ambition. You are a perpetrator of deceit. And then he handed down the sentence. 25 years in federal prison. No parole, no early release, no more suits, no more stages, no more headlines he could control. When the gavel fell, it echoed like an ending. Nathan was escorted out in cuffs. He didn't look at me. Not once. Outside, flashbulbs snapped and voices shouted. But I didn't stop for them. I walked calmly to the car waiting at the curb, where Monica stood beside the door, her arms crossed and a soft smirk on her face. You did it, she said. No, I replied, placing my hand on my belly. We did. We drove in silence, the city sliding past the windows like a memory I no longer needed to carry. I looked out at the skyline and felt nothing but space. Freedom. Peace. Nathan Marlowe was no longer part of my future. He was a chapter closed by gavel and truth. And I was already writing the next one. 2 months after the verdict, on a chilly October morning, I gave birth to James. It happened quietly, without drama, in a private birthing suite with soft lights and classical music playing in the background. Monica was by my side, holding my hand through the contractions, reminding me to breathe, to focus, to push through. And when it was over, when that first cry split the room open like sunlight through storm clouds, I felt something inside me settle. Not just relief, not even joy, but something older, deeper. I felt safe. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head full of dark, feathery hair. His eyes were wide and steady, like he already understood more than he should. He didn't cry for long, just enough to let the world know he was here. And then he curled against my chest, warm and weighty, the soft rhythm of his heartbeat echoing into mine. In that moment, everything I had been through, every lie, every betrayal, every headline, every court hearing, faded to background noise. James was the only thing I could hear. He was real. He was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a woman recovering from destruction. I felt like a woman building something new. The hospital room smelled like lavender soap and clean linen. My parents came to visit, bringing a pale blue blanket hand-knit by my mother. My father stood quietly by the window, watching his grandson sleep, and whispered, "You did good, kiddo." Monica cried more than I did. We stayed 2 nights, just long enough for me to feel confident and rested. I didn't need the nurses reminding me how to hold my baby, how to change him, how to swaddle him tight. I'd been ready long before he arrived. Not because I had it all figured out, but because I knew, deep in my bones, that James wasn't just someone I brought into the world. He was someone I fought for. When we brought him home, it wasn't to the penthouse. I had sold that monument to dishonesty the moment Nathan was sentenced. I didn't even go back to pack. Monica oversaw it all. Most of the furniture went into storage. The art collection was liquidated. The proceeds folded neatly into a trust for James. Our new home was a brownstone in Brooklyn, with ivy on the exterior and warm hardwood floors inside. It had character, and more importantly, it had light. Sun poured through the front windows every morning and kissed James's bassinet by 8 a.m. sharp. I had a small garden out back. The kitchen smelled like coffee and fresh bread most days. And the silence? It didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt earned. I named the foundation 3 weeks after James was born. The Marlowe Fund. Ironic, maybe, but purposeful. I wanted the name Nathan had tarnished to mean something better now. The foundation was built to support women, artists, entrepreneurs, young mothers who had been taken advantage of, manipulated, defrauded, not just financially, but emotionally. Women who had been told they were crazy when they were right. Women who had been silenced, erased. We offered legal support, financial counseling, emotional mentorship, real resources, no pity. I wasn't just a donor. I showed up. Every Wednesday, Monica and I held open office hours. Women would walk in, some nervous, some defiant, some broken, and they'd sit across from me, telling stories that mirrored my own in terrifying, familiar beats. I didn't give them false hope. I didn't tell them it would be easy. But I told them they weren't alone, and that changed everything. James grew quickly. He was quiet but observant. He liked books more than blocks, music more than cartoons. He had a giggle that could break glass, and a temper that came and went like summer rain. And he loved the garden. I'd push him on the swing while reading aloud legal articles or poetry, depending on the day. Sometimes I just watched him chase butterflies with stubby little legs and imagined what the world might look like through his eyes. A world with no betrayal, no masks, no Nathan Marlowe. One afternoon, I was in the garden with him when my phone buzzed. A message from Linda. Just a single link. No message. The headline read, "Disgraced financier Nathan Marlowe's final appeal denied. Sentence upheld." I stared at it for a long moment, not because I didn't understand, but because I was waiting for the rush of victory, the stab of vindication, the final release of years of anger. But none of it came. All I felt was peace. Like a final door had clicked shut behind me, and I didn't even need to lock it. Nathan was a ghost now, not some looming shadow over my life. Just a man in an orange jumpsuit with a number stitched to his chest. No empire, no headlines, no future. He would serve his time, and I would live mine. James called out from the swing, "Higher, Mama, higher." I smiled. "Higher it is, my love." I pushed him gently, watching as he rose into the sunlight, his laughter filling the garden. The wind tugged at the leaves, the smell of rosemary drifted through the air, and I felt my heart lift with him. I wasn't the woman from the viral video anymore. I wasn't the betrayed wife, or the courtroom warrior, or the whispered headline. I was Elise Marlowe, a mother, a builder, a survivor, a force, and I was free. In the end, this wasn't a story about a man's fall from grace. It was a story about a woman's rise from the ashes, about how truth, when fought for, becomes justice, and how justice, when earned, becomes peace. Thank you truly for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in Elise's journey resonated with you. Maybe you've been betrayed, maybe you've had to rebuild, or maybe you just needed a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks into a courtroom, holds a baby in its arms, and simply refuses to break. The lesson here is clear. Never let anyone define your worth by how they see you. Truth has a way of rising, even through ruin. And when someone tries to bury you in lies, remember, you are not the soil. You are the seed. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of the world carries your own story? If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or made you feel just a little bit less alone, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's how we continue sharing stories that matter, about love, loss, justice, and the quiet power of starting over. Until next time, take care of yourself and believe in your ability to begin again.